Hi, today I'm going to take you through the steps of making a tree symbol, or properly a block in AutoCAD. I'll be doing a tree, but these same steps hold true if you were making any sort of block, maybe a piece of street furniture, or maybe a building footprint, or whatever. I'm going to do a tree because it's challenging in a few ways, and it makes us explore some tools that we probably haven't looked at in detail yet in any of the exercises. So what do I mean by tree symbol? Well, if you're laying out a plan, um, the landscaping symbols can go a long way in making the plan look like something. Here's a rendering I did for this Rivers Casino project. You may be familiar with that. And you can see that the trees really sort of add something to the rendering. If we zoom in a little bit, we can see more closely some of the details of this rendering. I didn't do this design, I just did the rendering. They wanted something to hang on their wall. So you can see what I'm going for here is a sort of hand-drawn look. I like that. Um, it's obviously computer generated. You can see all the tree blocks are identical, but I'm imitating a marker rendering. Also on this pavement, sometimes you'll see this just as a flat gray. Well, I'm imitating here a like a watercolor wash type of rendering, how people would have done it in the old days. Just makes for a much more interesting multi-dimensional work. So if we look at these blocks, these are AutoCAD blocks that I think I post-processed this image in SketchUp, but most of the heavy lifting is done in this block. So that's a type of tree symbol. I'm just going to search. I'm just Googling landscape tree symbol plan view because we're looking for the top view, the bird's eye view, plan view properly. And we can see there's a wide variety of takes on this. These are actually quite nice. They're not quite what I was going for. They're a little flatter. The color's more one-dimensional, but very nice. What's interesting is some of these symbols go back to the earliest days of AutoCAD. I've been seeing literally these symbols since probably 1993. Um, this one too. Some of them are newer, but there's lots to like about these simple symbols, and we'll do a couple. We'll start with a simple one, and then we'll do something a little more complex. Black and white, same thing. You can see a lot of the same symbols here. This one is literally the same. This one is literally the same. Somewhere, some guy drew these by hand 40 years ago, and we're still copying and pasting his vision. These are kind of interesting. They start to get a little more three-dimensional. Not crazy about the sort of monochromatic thing that's going on there, but you can see there's different takes on it. And if you look at landscape architectural firms, they're usually pretty good about how they do this. A lot of firms still do their renderings by hand. These have some nice actual. I kind of like these shrubs. There's some nice stuff going on here. So we'll pick one, and that's what I'm going to use as a sort of guide. The best thing to do would be to draw one by hand if you had some. That's kind of nice. Some marker chops, and then actually turn that into CAD. But I'm going to try to find something that I like. It's much easier to work on something that you like. Let's start with a simple one first. And I think I like this one, very simple. And then we'll do something a little more complex. I'm just going to go ahead and using snipping tool, I'm just going to snip this just for reference, just to keep me mindful of what it is that I'm drawing. So with the snipping tool, I'm just going to copy that, and I can just Control V, Windows paste this into CAD. Okay, first thing I need to do is, if I was to draw this, I'm going to be very cognizant about my layers. It's not possible for me to emphasize the importance of layers enough in anything to do with AutoCAD. Layers are everything. The amount of time I spend not doing design because I'm fixing layers is significant. Layer control is absolutely critical in AutoCAD, and you can have a virtually unlimited number of layers. Right now, I have no layers because I started a drawing from scratch, but I'm going to go ahead and spin up a template from my company. And if you end up doing AutoCAD at a company, you will find that by and large, the layers that you're drawing on are dictated to you. So not so for us. We've got some freedom here. I'll introduce some layers as we get into the final project that I'd like you to do. You'll start to see how layers just help your sort of CAD thinking, for lack of a better word. So here's taking a moment to spin up this other version of CAD, actually Civil 3D, which is a flavor of AutoCAD. And I want to show you just what our standard empty drawing looks like. So the empty drawing that we just started looks like this, with nothing in it and no layers. But if you're working at a company, it's very likely that when you start a new drawing, your empty drawing is going to already be set up with a template that has a lot of layers that you'll be expected to adhere to the layer dialog. So here's an empty drawing for my current company, Hager Engineering. And you can see that it's modular. Remember I talked about building layers modularly? So here the A prefix is for architectural elements. C stands for civil. We're a civil company, so we have a lot of civil layers. V stands for topographic survey. Don't ask me why that's V, because when I see V, I think of void. And we have a lot more than this. This is just one of the empty templates. We have a UT prefix for utilities. We have GRD for grading elements. DEMO, demo, for layers containing entities that we know are going to be demolished as part of the plan. You know, a lot of times we're tearing down stuff to build other stuff, and so on. So modular layers is the way to go. So if I'm going to draw this plan, I can see I need at least 3 or 4 layers. I need this main color of green. I need these lines. I need these dots. You would think you could put those on the line layer, and maybe you can, but I always recommend more layers rather than fewer. So that's 3 so far, and 4 for the drop shadow. And I'm going to put a 5th one in there, a no plot layer. When we're working accurately, which is all the time now, I might want to have this circle there, even if I never want to see it plotted. I like how this color just ends without an actually drawn circle there. But how am I even going to hatch a circle if the circle doesn't exist? So I want a no print layer that I can maybe have some crosshairs on and sort of keep my geometry honest. So I'm going to make a few new layers. I think I said 5. So for landscape architecture, I usually use the LS prefix. So this is how I would do it. Usually, like I say, you're told what to do. And for right now, just sort of get the idea of what I'm talking about. If you want to do your own layers slightly different, of course, that's fine. So LS for landscape elements. Hatch, because that's what the thing actually is. These are just conventions. That's going to be a green hatch in AutoCAD. And green 1. All right, so it's a landscape layer, it's hatched, that tells me it's a field of color, and I'm even telling myself it's green. Also, I'm gonna have landscape. You know what I should do? I should give this a tree symbol, I should give this a tree signifier. So it's a, to me, to anyone that sees this would consider this a deciduous tree. So I'm going to also include deciduous tree 01 in all these layer names. Seems excessive, but I'm telling you, when you open a drawing with 300, 400 layers, you're really happy when the layer control is tight. It can get out of control really fast. So I'm about to make 2 trees. So I want my layers to, for the most part, be separate for the 2 trees. So on this first one, deciduous 1, I'm going to go ahead and tag each layer with that module. um, hatch drop shadow. Sorry, landscape 301. Also, if I'm tired of typing this, I can swipe that, Control C, keep that ready to copy because I'm a terrible typist, as maybe you've noticed. Lines. All right. I'm just going to Control V, dots. I'm not going to say points because I'm not going to use points. As you saw in the previous video, points can change style. I never want a situation where these little dots all of a sudden start appearing as targets or whatever, right? And this is going to be a no print. And what colors am I going to use? Well, for the green 01, I'm going to find a green in true color that I kind of like. I might try and match that one a little bit. So it looks like it's a little yellower. That's actually pretty close. I'll take that for green 01. For the drop shadow, it's a little darker. What I'm going to do is see if I can't have a relationship between those two. So I'm going to swipe, copy, and then paste that into this other color. And now I'm going to start that as my point of departure. And I know I just want to make that darker. So it's starting with the same color. And now I'm just changing it down. It's much easier than trying to, and maybe I'll desaturate it a little bit. I'll gray it up a little more than on my sample is. And I'm going to make this quite a bit darker. Don't be afraid to make shadows really dark. It's more dramatic. And I may end up making that darker still later, but I can always come back and adjust this. The lines are going to be very thin. In the next video, I'm going to introduce our CTB file that controls our line weight. But let me just explain how we're going to control line weight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is going to be black, skinny to fat. 6, 7, 8 is going to be gray line, skinny to fat. And then we get into real skinny black lines. 9 is a skinny black line, and 11 is the skinniest black line that we have in our that we're able to plot. So I'm going to make those number 11. So where it starts to get weird because that's sort of a salmon color, but it's going to plot black. Mostly lines are black. We don't do lines in color typically, and this is how we render with markers as well. You make the colors. The fields are in color, but the lines are typically not in color. This is a traditional, watercolor and pen look. And if you were doing this by hand, and this is what we're imitating, the color goes on first, and then the line work goes on in black. And I've got some real skinny lines on here. Those might be, no, those are black too. They look green because they're underneath this transparent layer of tree color, which is sort of a nice look, very, very subtle. Maybe you didn't even see them right away. Okay, so that's that. The dots, I'm gonna make little, not sure how I'm gonna make those yet, probably tiny lines, and those are gonna wanna be a little bit thicker. I'm gonna start with a red color. And again, since everything's gonna be by layer, we can adjust. On the no print layer, I'm gonna use a color that I know is not something that I'm typically drawing with, like a purple or something like that. That's typically not in the color palette of what I'm drawing with. This drawing might actually be the exception because I've got some landscaping splotches on here. These are meant to be flower beds, right? So that's the rare exception. Ordinarily, it's not a color that you typically see. In a normal drawing. So okay, so I got my layers set up, and okay, here's my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers that I need for that block. I'm going to add a 6th layer, and that is the layer that is going to contain the actual block itself. So all these elements I can control by layer, but that tree block itself needs to be on a layer as well. Once again, you never draw on layer 0. Um, and the color of this doesn't really matter because um, there's not going to be anything on it except entities on all these other layers that are already colored by layer. Okay, let's start with the no print. I'm going to double click on that. What's that's called even? Status. Double click on the status column to make that, you see that check mark to make that current. You can also right click and set current that way. And I'm going to draw a circle. I used a C enter, but you can use the pull down here to draw a circle. I'm going to use center radius. And I'm just going to pick a point, and I'm just going to start with, I'm thinking in drawing units here, not real world units. How big do I want this to be on the paper? Let's say 1 inch. So you can see the diameter is the default. If I type in 1, enter, I've got a circle that has a diameter of 2 inches. Okay, I wanted 1 inch. I can redefine it there. Why did that happen? Circle. Oh, because it's center radius, of course, I didn't notice. All right, so this is my no print layer. L for line, pick a point. I'm gonna make it 1.5. I just gave it direction and it has a value of 1.5. I'm gonna make another line vertically, pick a point, type in 1.5, enter, and that's it. And move these from midpoint to center. You can see I have center set up as a running object snap. Let's look at my running object snap here. Right now I have it set for endpoint, midpoint, center, intersection, insertion point, and I usually have node also. And that covers most of what I do for my basic drawing. Okay, these properly should be a center line. So I'm going to select them. Here I'm going to break my rule and not go by layer. This is a no print layer anyway, remember? And it looks like none of my line types are loaded. So let's go ahead and load those up. And I don't want to change that, but I want to change the value of these. Here we go. So I want to change these values to center 2, which is a smaller center line. That's what I want to see from my no print layers. It keeps me organized about my geometry. How am I going to get this drop shadow in? I'm going to copy this, select that circle, copy. Remember, copy requires a from and a to. I'm going to pick a point anywhere. I can turn off F8 for this. And so just ballpark my circle is 1 inch. I want to come down about yay much. So that's a 1/2 inch. So that's maybe 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to copy from here using relative coordinates at 0.125 for 1/8 of an inch, comma, negative 0.125. What does this mean? That means relative from the point, and you can see why it doesn't matter that I picked any point because it's relative to that point. I could have picked the center point, but there's no reason to because this is going to be relative to any point. And so I'm coming over x positive 0.125, y negative 0.125, and it places it right there. Could you eyeball it? Sure. Get in the habit of not eyeballing stuff. We draw precisely in AutoCAD. I'm going to trim this up. I don't want this double circle. It's going to start making me see like it's going to make weird things start happening in my mind. So I'm going to use the trim command, select that circle, enter, and now trim up things that intersect it. And you can see how this is starting to shape up. I'm going to go ahead and hatch these areas. This is all still no print. So I'm going to make my hatch layer current the same way by double clicking on it. And now I'm going to draw some hatch. It's asking me to select what I want to hatch. And that'll work okay, but I'm gonna look at the command line and see that I have choices there. I could pick an internal point, I can undo it, I could check the settings. Let's just look at the settings, T enter, and see what some of the hatch settings are. So one thing I wanna make sure I'm doing is using a solid hatch here. There are many, many, many kinds of hatches that you can use, but for this field of color, we want solid. I made a mistake one time for a couple of weeks where I had a different hatch pattern selected. It was actually this one, ANSI 131, and it was the scale was so small that it looked solid, and I thought I was hatching solid, and every drawing I made was huge, and that was because it had this incredibly detailed hatch. And I'd make a PDF, and the PDF would be like 20 meg, and I'd send it to somebody and they couldn't print it. They're like, what's going on? And it took me a while to realize because it looked solid because the scale was so small. Anyway, it doesn't hurt to make sure, confirm that you're using the correct settings. Okay, since I have this pick box, I know it's asking me to select the entity, and I'll just go ahead and do that. I'm going to make my hatch, my drop shadow layer current by clicking on the layer, right click, set current, do it a different way this time. I'm gonna use the same command, hatch. Now in this case, if I pick on this entity, it's probably not gonna give me what I want because it's not a closed shape. And you see it won't even hatch that, unable to fill boundary. So return, spacebar, same command. Now I have to go to the settings, and instead of selecting objects, I'm going to pick points. Notice my cursor is different. I don't have a pick box anymore. I've got a just crosshairs with no pick box, and this is allowing me to pick point, and it's going to fill the area until it finds a closed shape. Now I should have been able to do that with one hatch, so I'm going to select that and delete, and I'm going to hatch again. And notice at the bottom, I didn't really have to go to settings. I can do S for select objects or K for pick point without going into the settings. So because this is solid, it doesn't matter that it's in three pieces, and it's not in three pieces technically. It's one piece of hatch. So this is shaping up pretty good. I'll draw my lines next, make that layer current. And here I'm just going to have some fun using the line command. I'm just going to try and imitate what I see there. Taking care to not accidentally snap to an endpoint or something. And look what's happening. I'm not seeing these lines because of draw order. First thing I'll try is RE enter for regen, and that redraws my drawing, and I can see they really are on top. These are looking a little too consistent. So maybe I'm trying to make this look hand drawn, right? So L enter for line. I got 3 down here. And I keep hitting enter, which is spacebar enter, which is the same command again. So let's see, let's go one more here. It's got 2 more here. And 1, 2, 3, 4 here, and kind of like 2 pairs. Okay, how'd I do? Not bad. Hard to tell until I see it printed. Let's pop into layout mode and just see what this is looking like. So if I go to print, and remember, I've just been using this monochrome, or have I been using monochrome? I think I've been using monochrome. And that will give me monochrome for the lines, but for the true color comes in color. It's not terribly far off. I'm seeing my no print layers. That's because I forgot to do the key thing to make them no print, which is to define the layer as a non-printing layer. So here it is. Plot, no. If I do another preview, that's what I'm expecting to see. Oops. That's what I'm expecting to see. It's not terribly far off. If you think maybe these curves, well, it's too thick, obviously, but maybe we think these little curves, little bits of curves are important, or maybe I'm coming out a little too far, these details. We're getting really small right now, so we can always adjust this later. I won't really know how I like this until I see it in place, but it's not looking horrible. Let's add the remaining things. Go back. And I'm going to make my dots layer current by double clicking on that status. And they're not actually going to be dots, they're going to be tiny lines. How tiny? I don't know. How about 0.01? And actually, if I see how these are distributed, notice that they're kind of more here in the lower right quadrant and fewer here in the upper left quadrant. It's another way of working with the drop shadow and giving a sort of abstract 3D illusion to this tree. The drop shadow is what really does it, takes it off the page a little bit. But this is another way of doing it. This symbol, I know just from experience, started life in two different places. It started life without the drop shadow, and then some artist came along and added the drop shadow. How do I know this? Because I recognize this symbol from like 1993. So I'm going to just place one of those. I'm going to turn off my O snap settings because I don't want these snapping all over the place. Remember how to turn those off? F3. Now I'm going to copy this and just kind of turn off F8. And I'm just sort of freehanding this, putting a few up here, but mostly I'm putting more down to help reinforce this 3D effect. Now, if I was really smart or detail oriented, these wouldn't be tiny lines, they would be also little blocks. Because what's going to happen is I'm going to preview this, not like it, wish I could change the shape or size or whatever of these, but of course I can't because it's not a block. So I should have probably made those also blocks. But let's see what happens when we preview this. Well, it's not horrible. There may be a little long. I think they may have to be actually round to get this effect. I'm going to do it. You think I'm not going to take the time to do that? You don't know me at all. How do I delete them? Well, there's a couple of ways I could do it. I could select it and isolate that layer. That turns everything else off. And then I can just delete them. I'm going to undo that, undo, unisolate, undo, undo, undo. I'm just hitting U, enter to undo. So that's one way to do it. Isolate the layer, then delete them. Or you could select one, right click, and say select similar, and then delete. Now, take care because similar, that's not a very precise term. It may surprise you what AutoCAD thinks is similar. You may think you want one thing done and it may have a whole different idea. So do take care. Okay, I'm going to do this the right way. I'm going to make that a little round block. So I'm going to make a tiny circle and the radius should be like 0.01, maybe not even, maybe half that. I'm going to move this to 0, 0. We actually want to make our blocks with a 0, 0 insertion point. Just take me at my word on that right now. I just don't feel like getting into it. Okay, so also, I hope that you're tracking this because I'm actually going down a bit of a rabbit hole. So I'm on the right layer for what these things are. I'm going to go ahead and just hatch this. And actually, I don't even need the circle, but I'm going to, in fact, I'm not going to. I'm going to erase the circle because that's going to add line width. I'm just going to keep the dot. And I can always change the size of that if I want to, undo. Here's the thing. Remember I said never draw on layer 0? Well, the reason we don't draw on layer 0 is because layer 0 has a special function when you're making blocks. Layer 0 is a chameleon layer. When you draw a block on layer 0 and then insert that block, it will take on the characteristics of whatever layer you insert it on. That's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to place this hatch on layer 0 for the purposes of making the block. I'm going to make the block now, B enter. This is going to be called ls dot, well, let's say it, deciduous tree 01 dot. The insertion point is already set up for 0, 0. I'm just going to accept that. I'm selecting the hatch. That's all that's in it. It's a small block, and I'm going to say OK. Now notice it changed its color. That's because this became a block, and it went to the current layer, which is ls deck tree 1 dots. I hope you caught that. If not, rewind it again. So now that this is a dot, I can I'm going to do the same thing I did before. It's hard to draw randomly, you'll find. On the computer, it's much easier to draw precise. Sketching, CAD is not a good sketching tool. With stuff like this, underdo it, don't overdo it. Let's try our print preview again. Tired of finding that. Notice you can do a shortcut to previous plot. That's looking pretty close. A little too big? A little too big maybe? Well, maybe, maybe not. It's hard to tell. Let's say they are a little too big. Because they're a block, I don't need to go through that whole process again. I can select one, go to the block editor, and I'm just gonna scale this. Base point is gonna be 0, 0. That's our insertion point. And I'm gonna say 0.75, a little too big. Right click, close block editor. Do you wanna save your changes? Yes. Let's see if that did it. You see how blocks are the thing, right? Very useful. Very useful. Let's do that plot again. You know, that's better. That's getting pretty close. I could do it again. I could make them smaller if I want them smaller. But because it's so easy to change that kind of stuff, looks like I could use a few more here too. Because it's so easy to change that kind of stuff, I think these lines might be a little thick, right? These number 11 lines. I might have to take extra steps to make that smaller. But I think you can see it's not bad. We're kind of in the ballpark. You're seeing that this drop shadow is perhaps much too dark. Well, what I plan on doing is adding a transparency to that layer so that we can actually see stuff through it. So I'll start with giving that a transparency of like 25%. And what this means, you can see it lightened up already. What this means is that if we have, maybe we have, a curb or a building or something, what am I trying to do here? Just copy this. I'm draw ordering that to the back. You start to see that it's transparent. And that's going to behave differently. And let's see how that looks. We're not seeing the transparency because in our plot dialog, plot transparency was not selected. Let's try another preview. That's starting to look like something. So a true transparency, the tree is not transparent, but the shadow is. It's just going to darken anything that's around it. So that's a simple block in CAD. Oh, we haven't made it a block yet, though, have we? We have not. So let's go back and actually make this a block. I'm going to erase that. I'm going to window all this. I'm going to move it from the center point to 0, 0. We make blocks at 0, 0 always. The exceptions are so few. Let's just say always. I can't stop myself. I'm just going to copy this a few more times. This is kind of like fun drawing, sort of non-technical and kind of fun. I know it's not fun, right? It's what passes for fun. Okay, I'm ready to make my block now. B, enter. Look, I've got one other block in this drawing. So this is going to actually be called tree 1. I'll leave that landscape prefix on this, although you don't really have to. Pick point 0, 0. I'm going to set that. Select objects. I'm going to take all of it. And now this is on the wrong layer. It's on dots. I want this on the actual tree. It didn't change how it looks. Let's talk about why we layered this so much. What if it turns out I just don't want that drop shadow? I can easily just, well, what if the no print bugs me? I can freeze that layer and it's still there, but we don't see it. It doesn't plot, but maybe it bugs me in model space. I don't like looking at it. Maybe that drop shadow is just too much. I could turn that off or freeze that. I've got full control. Maybe, you know what, the dots just ain't working for me. That's okay too. I can turn that layer off. So we've got full control and it's still a block. Now I can copy this thing just like I was copying the dot. And I think this is served its purpose. And that's starting to look like something. Maybe a few of them are going to be bigger. I can change their XY. And if you change the XY, you should also always change the Z to match, even though its value is going to be nothing that concerns us. I'm going to turn on those dots layers and the drop shadow layer. And let's see what this is looking like when we go to print. That's not bad. It looks pretty good. And it may turn out that I want, I often do, some transparency on the trees as well. Maybe I want these to be very subtle. Maybe I want that hatch, that green hatch to be, um, let's start there and kick that down to like 50%. and it's a little weird. We should have something to compare it to. Let me jump over to let me find a townhome or something that we can bring in here. Okay, I found some townhomes in a project. We'll just paste this to get some context here. All right, so we've got a little some context for our trees. Here's where draw order starts to come in. I know I want my trees on top, right? So I'm going to go ahead and do a quick little landscape plan, humanize this design a little bit. You can start to see how one block ain't going to do it. You sort of need um, different blocks, different colors, and but we'll get a pretty good feel for what's going on, I think. Don't be afraid to cluster trees. That's typically how it's done. You don't have them spread out. Here I'm putting these on these little islands, so it's a little different. Okay, I'm going to make sure that these are in front by selecting one, right click, select similar, DR enter for draw order, and making sure they're in. Well, first I'll start off by doing it wrong. We'll see what it looks like when they're in back, right? And you can already see it's like under the pavement and stuff, right? We'll see how that looks. Okay, actually looks, it's not bad. But obviously my trees want to be above the building. But I wanted to sort of explain how draw order works there. I'm just going to do this within the viewport. I'm going to select one, right click, select similar, DR, enter, and F to bring them to the front. Now let's try the plot again. And that's more like what we're looking at. And you can see how the transparencies are actually kind of nice in this case. These lines want to be much thinner. They're not responding to being the thinnest line because I haven't set up a proper CTB yet. I'm using this monochrome. No idea how, what number 11 means to them. Let's look at what this is, this CTB file, plotter control, plot style file. I've always heard of it as plotter control. So this is, for each color, it tells me how it's going to plot. All these colors basically plot the same. In my next video, I want to bring in our CTB that we're going to use that I've been describing and show the difference when you're actually plotting with line weight. This is basically plotting with no line weight. The tree lines are the same as the building footprint, are the same as the sidewalk, and that's not how you would do it. But even given that, I think it's not terrible what we've got here. You get the idea. But yeah, it's definitely time to introduce some of our output control. So if I wanted to do a more complex tree, let's go back and look at some of these other trees, and let's find one that we think looks a little more challenging. Okay, so poking around a little, finding some stuff. This is one of those things where when you're looking for it, you're not going to find it. These are quite nice. There's tons of samples. Not all of them so directly applicable to CAD. That's quite nice. Also, actually, these are all pretty nice. Yeah, I like those. I kind of like this one here. It's a little more markerish. I'm going to control plus on my browser just to enlarge the screen a little bit and go take another snip of this. Probably not going to take you through the whole thing because it's going to get a little repetitive, but you get the idea. We're just looking to use this as a guide, or hell, even trace over it, could do. And you might be thinking, well, can I just buy these things? Of course you can. You can also buy fully formed landscape plans from a landscape architect and fully formed urban design plans from a land planner. But the point here is we're trying to learn how to do it. So shortcuts at this point is not going to help you. There's a place for shortcuts, absolutely. Um, you can't be spending an hour drawing a symbol when you need 6 or 7 symbols for a plan. You're just going to have to get them any way you can. But now that we have the time and we're trying to learn how to do it, um, spend some time and learning the steps, learning what it takes. Another thing we could do is look at a real tree. Let's just look in the park and see if we find anything. These look pretty nice. And this is a worthwhile exercise because you start to understand how and why things look the way they do. So what we're seeing here is how the light reveal. Look at this. This is a pretty perfect tree. I'm drawn to this one. It's a pretty perfect tree. Um, and we're seeing how light reveals the shape of a tree. It's got a little bit of three-dimensionality, but not too much. I wouldn't do this excessive. Part of why it looks so nice is because of this extreme lighting, but that would be a little too dramatic for our purposes. But you could definitely squander an hour in a worse way than trying to draw what you see and come to understand how light reveals shapes. And it's a useful exercise. It actually is. I'm going to bring that too, just in case. I just sort of like it. But this one's quite nice. This would do. So what I might do if I wanted to draw this is it's going to start off the same way. I've got this no print layer, and you can see now why that is. Look, all these other layers came in when I brought in those townhomes. My no print layer, I'm going to make that current again. Notice that the shade on this one is falling the other way. Our shade is falling to the lower right. Our drop shadow, this is falling to the lower left. Well, you can always change that with the rotation of the block. And that's an interesting thing. Like when I'm using this on top of an aerial photo, I want these drop shadows to match the direction of sunlight in the photo. So if we're looking at this is almost right out of the west. Man, that's not at an angle, that is directly horizontal, almost. Usually you'll find that it's a little more on an angle, but I guess when they shot these, they shot it at, yeah, this is more like it. You see this angle here? So it's to the right and up, to the right and up, almost 45 degrees, almost what we did, but we did ours to the right and down. But with block rotation, you can have this rotated anyway. Let's say we had to match that. I'm going to select similar, and I'm going to key in a new value for rotation of those blocks. And so that wants to be a 90-degree rotation, I believe. And now we can see they held their anchor point. They're all still in the right spot because it's in the center of that circle. But now we can see that the drop shadow would be matching um, if we were on an aerial that had shadow going that way. It looks just as convincing. Look, in fact, maybe a little fresher. To the bottom and to the right, that's the most traditional place for a drop shadow to go, the most traditional direction. But if you're matching like on an aerial photo, it looks weird if your shadow is going a different way than the existing stuff that you're on top of. So a little bit next level, but something to keep in mind when you're drawing on aerials, which we draw on aerials quite a bit. So it's something to keep in mind. Okay, so with my no print layer current, I might, when you're learning, there's nothing wrong with tracing over somebody's work for a educational exercise. As a professional, you'd want to come up with your own stuff. But as a student, it's perfectly forgivable to trace. This is a little inaccurate how it's drawn. You can see the center. I'm aligned with the center of the art, but I'm not. His cross is not on the center. That's okay. We'll fix that. I'm going to copy this over with ortho on and just watch. I'm trying to actually duplicate what he's done here. It's nice. It's nice and loose. It's a good sort of block. Um, so for this, I would have to make new layers. This is going to be a deck tree too. I'm not going to do all that now. Just want to sort of communicate how I would draw this. Think about if you were actually drawing this with markers. This would be more like regions, right? So I would define those regions with a polyline, and then I would add the hatch to those areas and adjust. So let's look at this brown area. Um, Pline, P-L-I-N-E for polyline. I'm going to start with nearest. Turn my ortho off and my object snap off. And I'm just defining this brown region. This is where I'm going to have the brown hatch. And you can see already, notice how the brown and green work together. There's going to be a fair amount of transparency involved in this. And I'm going to close that with an arc that perfectly matches my shape. So there's the region for the brown. And then on top of that, there's this green. You get the idea. I'm doing this really fast, so it's going to look a little unconvincing. But if you spend the time and it wants to be more curvy and not probably as geometric as this is going to be, but we'll see. C for close. This is key, this little blotch here. I'm not going to miss that one. This one too. These little details, these little imperfections make a rendering look like it was done by hand. I mean, we're not trying to, it's not going to fool anybody, but you get the idea. Okay, what I should have is a new layer for these images so I can turn them off. I don't want to lose their place, but I don't want to always be seeing them. So I'm going to add those limits to that layer. Okay, now I can sort of see what I'm working with. So I'm going to make my landscape hatch current. Now don't look, but for the purposes of speed, I'm violating my I'm doing shitty layer control. So this was the brown. It should be on its own layer, but I'm just going to go with it for the purposes of a quick demo. I want to wrap this up. This is going way long. This green, I think, was more of a it was more of a green, wasn't it? I think so. Maybe a little more yellow in it. Something like that. Transparency should be controlled by layer. It will be because this layer has transparency already. Just make let's turn that image back on. And see how far we are off it. That's looking pretty good. The rest of this should be like a yellowish green. I could see 1, 2, 3 more areas here that need color assigned, but I'm not going to do that now. I'm going to put this on my lines layer. To the center of the block. And I'm going to copy that from 0, 0 to 0, 0. and rotate that 90 degrees. So we have that. In this case, we want these circles to plot. So that shouldn't be on my no print layer. That should be on my, my lines layer. And let's just see how this is looking so far. Just get some idea of where it's at. The lines always want to be on top. And let's just see how this is. If it's even getting in the ballpark. It's actually starting to look like something already. This is going to take a fair amount of adjustment. This is a situation where it might look a little weird at first. The brown definitely looks weird, but you know, I'm just starting, and you can see with some buildup in here, it'll get there. It'll definitely get there. That's precisely the way I drew these other blocks. You can see how I've got these layers building up and transparency. And you know, it's you put your time in up front, but then you have it. I've got those blocks. I can use them again and again. Trouble is, those are so rich that it's almost like too much, right? I can't. They've got limited use because they're so they're a little over the top. I could stand to like neutralize them a little bit, like I started to do here with the more transparency. Also notice like touch of blue, right? Until I pointed out, you probably didn't see it, but that really gives it that sort of marker. That's when you look at a marker rendering closely, you do start to see how there are colors in there that you wouldn't expect, right? Like this, the yellow, you probably wouldn't go there if you were starting with a tree. Look at these with this like purple. These are very nice. I could see these being like, you know, shrubs of some sort, and you know, lot of nice marker rendering going on here. These are also quite nice. Purple to green, secondary color harmony. So we accept it as logical, but unexpected choice. Um, you wouldn't give it a second thought until you start looking at it closely and sort of figuring it out. Mostly it's going to be yellows and greens though, you know, plant colors. And look at this, for decorative trees, you do need to go to the reds and purples. Otherwise everything is green, it just looks flat. A decorative pear tree, are so-called you know, decorative tree, typically we'll give those a different shape, maybe a hexagon or something, and we'll go to some different colors. Anyway, this is running quite long, so I don't want to beat it to death, but make a block or two. It's something that you'll be able to use in your final plan that we're working up. And stay tuned for more videos on other steps that we're doing moving forward. Thanks for watching.